Millionaire said, "If you beat me at chess, I'll give you $1 million," then shook hands after 7 moves. What happens when a Harlem teenager beats a billionaire in a public chess match? He never imagined he'd end up in handcuffs within the hour, or that a month later, he'd flip the entire justice system on its head. What happened next left the courtroom in the stunned silence. If you had told Tyron Brooks that one day he'd become a Harlem legend because of a chess game, he would have laughed in your face, and not a polite chuckle either. He'd give you that sideways grin he reserved for nonsense and fools, maybe add something like, "Yeah? And maybe the mayor's gonna hand me the keys to the city while he's at it." Tyron didn't believe in fairy tales. He believed in the 8x8 board and the power of logic. Everything else? Noise. Empty promises dressed up like opportunity. He'd seen enough to know the difference. It was a heavy, humid morning, the kind that made even the pigeons too tired to flap their wings. The air hung low over Harlem, sticky and slow, like time was dragging its feet. Tyron sat on the same wooden bench he'd claimed as his own years ago, right in the middle of Frederick Douglass Park. The boards were worn, creaky under his weight, but it was his throne. In front of him sat his father's old folding chessboard. Faded wood, frayed edges, pieces smoothed by years of strategy and sweat. Tyron's fingers moved across the board like they had muscle memory of their own, like they knew the weight and rhythm of every piece without needing to look. Bishop to c4, knight to f6. His movements were silent commands. The game was his orchestra, and he was the only one holding the baton. Every time he sat down, the world paused, and people came to watch. Because if you were going to lose, you wanted it to be poetic. You wanted to lose to Tyron Brooks. He wasn't out there for money. He didn't care for attention. What he did care about was the board. He believed chess wasn't just a game, it was life. And in life, like on the board, if you didn't know how to see 3 moves ahead, you'd get taken out fast. Tyron's backpack, slouched beside him, didn't carry school books. Inside was that same chessboard, his father's final gift before he passed. His old man had been a bus driver, a blue-collar genius who taught himself the game from a library book and taught Tyron everything he knew. "One day, boy," he'd said, "they gon' call you the Black Kasparov, but don't play for trophies, play for dignity." That board was sacred. Tyron told anyone who'd listen about the day his father beat Pastor James 3 times in a row on that very board, and how the pastor canceled church the next Sunday from sheer embarrassment. "Pride cometh before the fall," he said, and Daddy made sure it fell real hard that day. That morning, everything started with a simple act of kindness. A small thing. An old woman, cane, big floral purse, years carved into her spine, dropped her bag near the corner. Tyron didn't think twice. He jogged over, scooped up the oranges rolling across the sidewalk, helped her gather her things, and offered one of those soft smiles that said, "I see you. Bless your soul, child," she whispered, staring at him like she could see deeper than his skin, like she could see something waiting to rise. And then, like a character dropped from the wrong script, he arrived. A white man in a tailored navy suit, silk tie, shining watch, and an attitude so thick you could spread it on toast. He looked like money, smelled like ego, and walked like the pavement should be grateful to hold him. When he stopped at the chess bench, Tyron barely glanced up. He didn't need to. He already knew the type. One of those Wall Street wolves who treated conversation like contracts and thought charm was something you bought. The man watched as Tyron finished a brutal checkmate against a seasoned old-timer who'd ruled this park's chess circle for a decade. The old man tipped his cap with a grunt. No shame, just respect. He knew talent when he saw it. "You play that well on purpose?" the stranger asked, voice smooth like syrup but thick with condescension. Tyron leaned back, unfazed. "I don't just play it," he said. "I breathe it." His words hit like a slap wrapped in velvet. The stranger smiled, the way a man does when he's about to offer a trap disguised as a challenge. "Play me," he said. "If you win, I'll give you $1 million. Cash. 1 game. No do-overs." The park changed in an instant. People perked up, heads turned, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the pigeons looked interested. Some laughed, some scoffed. But Mr. L, the unofficial elder of Harlem's chess circle, looked up from his thermos and muttered, "Boy, this ain't just a game. This a test." Without a blink, Tyron reached out and shook the man's hand. He didn't do it for the money. That million meant something, sure. But more than that, it was about respect. It was about the principle. He was going to show this man, and everybody else, that intellect sharpened in the fire of Harlem's public benches could slice just as deep as any Ivy League pedigree. The board was reset, white pawn to a 4. Tyron didn't speak. He let the game speak for him. The pieces moved, The air thickened, and the world narrowed down to 64 squares. The crowd barely breathed. People were leaning in, phones recording, sweat collecting on foreheads. And Tyron? He was still, focused. Inside, he heard his father's voice. Life's like chess, son. You mess up one move, you lose your future. But you learn to see the angles, learn to survive. You don't just win, you lead. By the fifth move, the man in the suit was sweating. By the sixth, he was shifting in his seat. And by the seventh, he reached out, paused, then extended his hand in defeat. He didn't say a word. No applause, no camera flashes, just silence. Thick, meaningful silence. And then Harlem erupted. Cheers, laughter, high fives, clapping, shouting. Someone yelled, "That's our king!" Another shouted, "Checkmate that Wall Street wallet." But Tyron didn't move. He sat still, eyes on the board. Because in his bones he felt it. This wasn't the end. This wasn't victory. It was a beginning. A storm was coming. Less than an hour later, the clouds arrived. Two cops approached the bench, uniforms stiff, hands twitching near belts. "You Tyron Brooks?" one asked. He had the expression of a man who couldn't remember the last time he smiled without someone getting hurt. "Yeah," Tyron replied, standing up slowly. "Something wrong?" "You're under suspicion for illegal gambling," the officer said. Mr. L, still clutching his thermos, choked. "You've got to be kidding. The kid played chess." The officer didn't even flinch. "It was a public wager. That's against code. We have to process this." The word process sounded like a threat. Click. The cuffs snapped shut like a gavel slamming down. Gasps echoed through the park. Phones went up. Voices rose. Tyron didn't resist. He just looked down, not at the officers, not at the crowd, but at the board. The same board his father had handed him. The one that had taught him that even kings can be cornered. And with the calm of someone who'd already seen the next three moves, he whispered to himself, "That was only the first move. What happened next would change everything. And trust me, you don't want to miss how it unfolded." The precinct reeked of sour coffee, cheap disinfectant, and something worse. The slow rot of justice left unattended. Tyron sat on a hard wooden bench in the intake room, the kind of furniture designed not for comfort, but for containment. His wrists were still locked in cold metal cuffs, biting into his skin just enough to remind him where he was and who was in charge. The officer who'd brought him in, a man with all the urgency of someone restocking snacks at a gas station, tapped lazily at a keyboard, typing with two fingers, like the paperwork was more exhausting than the actual arrest. "Let me guess," the other cop said, younger, smug, and far too satisfied with himself. "You thought that chess stuff made you untouchable, huh? Thought you were going to walk out of that park a millionaire and a hero?" He leaned forward like he expected Tyron to apologize. "This ain't a fairy tale, kid. This is an official charge. Illegal gambling, fraud, drop the Harlem Prodigy Act. That don't play in here." Tyron said nothing. Not because he had nothing to say. Believe him, he had a mouthful. But because he'd learned early in life that in places like this, words were like gasoline. Spill the wrong one, and things could go up in flames. He sat still, breathing slow, thinking hard. But inside, it wasn't fear boiling. It was fury. They hadn't arrested him for a crime. They arrested him for the message his win sent. The moment he shook that millionaire's hand in victory, he stopped being a harmless teenager and became a threat. In his pocket, still untouched, was his folded wallet, containing nothing but a bus pass, a worn picture of his father, and $2. They hadn't even checked it. They didn't need to. Their minds were made up before the cuffs even came out. He wasn't a suspect. He was a symbol, a warning. And the world, it noticed. Fast. By that evening, local news stations were already running the story. And like most stories involving young black men and police, the headlines weren't asking questions. They were drawing conclusions. "Chess protege or con artist," one Kyron read. "Teen involved in shady $1 million deal," claimed another. The most venomous one simply said, "Checkmate for Tyron Brooks." Not a single outlet mentioned that the challenge had come from the billionaire himself. Not one acknowledged that the game had been public, witnessed by dozens, cheered by hundreds. The way they told it, Tyron had lured a rich man into a trap, like he had pulled a hustle on the park bench instead of playing the cleanest game of chess Harlem had ever seen. That's when she arrived. Miriam West didn't walk. She glided like a blade sliding through silk, a veteran journalist with a voice that could cut steel and eyes that had seen enough to know when the wool was being pulled. She stood outside the precinct like she owned the building, her camera crew scrambling to keep up with her fire. She found Tyron's mother, Lorraine Brooks, a woman with tired hands and a spine made of concrete. Miriam shoved a mic in her face, her tone sharp. "Did you know your son was involved in illegal betting?" Lorraine didn't blink. "My son plays chess," she said slowly, clearly, like the words themselves were setting the record straight. "If a billionaire offers him money for winning a game, that's not gambling. That's acknowledgement. What's happening in that building right now? Holding a minor without legal counsel? That's the real crime. And not his. Yours." That clip? It didn't just go viral, it exploded. Within hours, the hashtags began stacking up like dominoes. Justice for Tyron. Chess not crime. Checkmate system. By midnight, Twitter was ablaze. Celebrities posted. Athletes commented. Civil rights groups released statements. Even a certain congresswoman reposted the clip with one word. Unacceptable. But still, Tyron sat, waiting. The next morning, the courtroom felt like a bad scene from a tired legal drama. The judge was a man in his 60s with the expression of someone who thought compassion was a weakness and paperwork was gospel. His robe looked dusty, and so did his thinking. The public defender assigned to Tyron, a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, barely shuffled his notes before mumbling, "We believe this is a misunderstanding, a complicated situation," and then sat down like his job was to quietly disappear. Meanwhile, the prosecutor was everything the media loved: young, polished, white, confident. He spoke in clean sentences designed for headlines. "There was a wager," he declared, flipping through glossy photos like they were damning evidence. "There was no written consent. There was a financial offer." The defendant demonstrated calm, calculated intent to profit. Tyron stared at him like he was watching a magician explain a disappearing act. Except this time, what vanished was the truth. No one asked Tyron what had actually happened. No one asked about the witnesses, the footage, the challenge that was thrown at him. Not by him. His silence? They called it guilt. His confidence? They called it manipulation. The judge banged the gavel once and muttered, "Hearing postponed. Court resumes tomorrow." Tyron was escorted out, but he could feel it, the shift outside. The energy was no longer quiet. Protesters were on the courthouse steps now, holding signs like shields. "Chess is not a crime. Don't judge the game. Judge the system." Brooks played fair. The system didn't. That night back in holding, a guard peeked into Tyron's cell. This one looked different. Not softer, but less robotic. "You got company tomorrow," the guard said. "Big shot. That billionaire. Hart something." "Hartford?" Tyron asked, not daring to believe it. "Yeah, says he wants to make a statement." Tyron didn't say anything out loud, but the look on his face was enough. He didn't trust it. Rich men didn't backtrack. They moved forward, usually right over people like him. But the way the guard said it, there was something unsettled in his tone. Like even he didn't get why someone with that much money was coming back into this mess. Then while close to midnight, the real shift happened. The door opened, and in walked a woman in a navy suit and glasses, sharp enough to start fires. Her heels clicked like gavel strikes. Her briefcase thudded onto the table. "I'm Carla Dupree," she said without waiting for a handshake. "I'm your new lawyer. Real one dot." She didn't smile. She didn't offer false hope. She opened Tyron's file like she already knew how this movie ended. "I'm not here to hold your hand," she said, underlining half the folder with red ink. "I'm here to hold them accountable. This judge? He's overdue for retirement, and I've been waiting for a case to remind him." For the first time in over 24 hours, Tyron leaned back and let out a long breath. No joy, no relief, just enough space to rest his head. Before closing his eyes, he whispered to himself, "That wasn't checkmate. That was just check. This is the climax. Everything you've waited for is happening now. Stay right here, because the move that flips the board is about to be played." The Manhattan courthouse stood tall and silent, its stone facade towering like a tombstone to forgotten justice. Somber, impassive, unmoved by the weight of the day. But that morning, the building pulsed with energy. The steps were flooded with people, not just spectators, but believers, warriors of truth and noise, brandishing signs and smartphones like shields and swords. The air crackled with anticipation, the kind you feel in your bones. This wasn't just a hearing. This was Judgment Day, and everybody knew it. Inside, Tyron Brooks walked through the marble corridor like he belonged there. Not because anyone told him he did, but because history was dragging him by the collar to this very moment. Beside him marched Carla Dupree, his attorney, whose presence wasn't just powerful, it was defiant. She didn't walk. She advanced. Every step was a statement. "Try me." Tyron didn't look around. He didn't need to. He felt the eyes, the hopeful, the skeptical, the bitter, all of them on him. To some, he was still that kid with the chessboard in the park. To others, he was a symbol now. Walking proof that one good move could upend a system built to crush you before you even saw the board. Inside the courtroom, Judge Grant sat perched like a buzzard in a robe. tired, impatient, and visibly annoyed. He wasn't accustomed to this kind of attention. The courthouse was his domain, a place where cases disappeared quietly and verdicts fell without echoes. This commotion, these cameras and chants, they didn't belong in his routine. He barely acknowledged Tyron before grumbling, "Are we ready to proceed?" The prosecutor, the same slick young face from yesterday, nodded confidently. He spoke like a man giving a lecture, not seeking justice, like he'd memorized his role from a legal drama and now was performing it with flair. That's when Carla stood up. "Your Honor," she began, her voice as sharp as the click of her heels. "Before we continue, I'm submitting a motion to dismiss all charges on the grounds that no crime has occurred." The judge sighed dramatically. "Again with the motions?" Carla didn't flinch. "Not again. At the right time. There is no case here. What happened in that park was not a bet. It was a public expression of admiration. There is no contractual agreement, no transfer of funds, no exchange rooted in deceit or risk." And right then, as if the scene had been scripted by someone who knew how to break tension like glass, the courtroom doors swung open. Glenn Hartford walked in, not with the confidence of a man used to being in charge, but with the gravity of someone who finally understood the cost of his silence. The room stilled. Every head turned. This was the billionaire, the challenge maker, the reason Tyron had spent nights behind bars. And here he was, in the flesh, choosing to walk into the chaos he could have ignored. He bypassed the aisle, the lawyers, the prosecutor, and stood directly in front of the bench. "Your Honor, I request permission to speak." The judge blinked. He knew who stood before him, a man who funded law schools and judicial scholarships, a man whose donations were in the courthouse's very plumbing. Denying him the floor would be like trying to unplug Wall Street. "Proceed," the judge muttered, reluctant but resigned. Glenn's voice was steady. "This young man did not wager with me. I made a public statement, a symbolic one, to honor his skill. There were no terms, no negotiation, no legal agreement. Just a moment where brilliance met opportunity. Any suggestion of a bet is a misrepresentation." The prosecutor shot up. "Objection. This is inappropriate. He's attempting to influence the court with status." "Influence?" Glenn turned to him, his expression carved in stone. "You build a case out of assumptions because you couldn't handle that a young black man beat someone like me in front of a crowd. You'd rather believe it was a scam than admit it was genius. If he had been selling me a soda, you wouldn't be here. But he outplayed me, and that made him dangerous to your narrative." A ripple ran through the courtroom. Whispers. A cough. The judge cleared his throat, visibly shaken now. Carla stepped forward again, sliding a folder onto the desk. "We are submitting video evidence, multiple witness statements, and a signed letter from Mr. Hartford stating the nature of the exchange was not transactional, but honorary." Judge Grant looked at the folder like it had teeth. He shifted in his seat, glanced at the prosecutor, then back at Carla, then at Tyron, who stood silently, arms folded, eyes calm. 20 minutes passed in deliberation. Then came the ruling. "All charges are dropped. Tyron Brooks is free to go." The courtroom erupted. Cheers, applause, gasps. Reporters scrambled. Flashbulbs burst. Outside, the crowd surged like a wave. Someone screamed, "That's our king!" And another shouted, "Play that game, Tyron." Judge Grant didn't meet anyone's eyes. He looked down, old and defeated. The prosecutor packed up without a word and slithered out the side door. Tyron walked out of the courthouse to the roar of the crowd. Cameras closed in. Microphones were shoved toward his face. He raised a hand, not to wave, but to hush. When the noise settled, he spoke. "I never asked to be a symbol. I just wanted to play chess. But if playing chess makes me a threat, maybe we need to ask what's really under threat here." A reporter near the front called out, "What are you going to do with the $1 million?" Tyron smiled. "Not wide, just enough." "You think this was ever about money?" Then with the smoothest motion, he reached into his bag, pulled out that old chessboard, his father's board, and set it up right there on the courthouse steps, the same one that had held dreams, pressure, and love. He placed the pieces carefully, reverently. "Lesson 1, he said, loud enough for the cameras. "You don't play for cash. You play to prove you think. You play to prove you exist." That image went viral. Not the courtroom drama, not the billionaire's speech, but a young man quietly setting up his chessboard on the steps of power, daring the world to sit down and play fair. 1 month later, the Tyron Brooks Strategic Academy opened in Harlem, a place where kids learned not just how to play chess, but how to navigate systems. Carla taught law workshops, Glenn quietly funded resources and computers, and Tyron, he taught the game and how to stay 10 steps ahead of people who'd rather you didn't even know you were a player. Judge Grant quietly retired. His replacement? A black woman from Brooklyn who made rulings in plain English and kept a chess clock on her desk. And Tyron? He still played, but not just on the board. Because now, he was making moves where the stakes were higher, where the pieces were people, and where he was never going to be a pawn again. Checkmate. Not to him, to the system. Запитати чат GPT.